and then we'll take lunch and then come back again to continue on visualization and other tools as a continuation of the morning one. And finally, we will end the day with some case studies. The videos have been shared on Google Drive, and I hope people have watched it, but we'll also do it here and maybe have just open discussion about, what, techniques that you learned about today, but also in the future could be used as there are resources from those case studies. And if there is time, we'll talk a little bit more just verbally between Balai, Otieno, and myself, some data resources from the GeoHealth Hub. So I think that's going to be a full day, and I hope very productive and informative day. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Tiffany, and we'll have a good ride.
Awesome.
All right.
Okay. All right. So can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. Great. So thanks, Kyros, for the introduction. Thanks everybody for coming. I've heard already this morning that some folks were a little bit nervous after being told to install R&R Studio. I promise the short course is going to be great. There's only a little bit of homework and 3 quizzes throughout the day. So that's a joke. There's no quizzes, I promise. All right, what we're going to get started with is a discussion of the emergence and future of public health data science. And actually, a lot of this talk is going to be more about the emergence of data science itself. I think when we were working on the paper, one of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about was actually where data science itself came from and what it meant to folks across a variety of disciplines. And so a lot of this morning's talk is going to be focused on that process, where data science came from. And then I'll talk a little bit about the public health piece as well. One of the things that I used to point out that data science is, as I think everybody is aware, a very new field, is this figure where I'm showing from Google Trends where the popularity of the search term data science on Google Trends since 2004. And if you look, there's really no emergence. Data science didn't exist as a discipline until at least 2012, and often a little bit later than that. And it's become, I think as we all know, an incredibly powerful domain, discipline, field, something. It's even in a lot of ways hard to say exactly what data science is, but I think it is, very obvious that it has been very powerful, an idea around which a lot of people have organized their efforts. It's one of the reasons that we're here today, is to think about what it means for us to be doing data science in public health and how we can implement that at these institutions. This is maybe dating myself just a little bit, but I put an arrow here that shows when I graduated from biostatistics, the PhD program, and in fact, data science didn't exist until well after I had graduated. So everything that I have learned and thought about data science is something that I've sort of learned on the job in some sense. This was not sort of part of my formal training. One of the things that I think is important to discuss, and boy, Kyros, I hope I don't get myself into trouble on this one. I should check if this is being recorded or broadcast or anything like this. So one of the things that shaped in some ways the information that went into the paper, and I guess I should sort of say as a disclaimer, a lot of what I'm going to say today is grounded in the ideas that came out of the paper, but is also we're sort of using that as a starting point for what I'm going to talk about today. And so when I'm pointing out the co-authors here, there's me and Ife Sun. Ife Sun is an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics. Linda Fried is the Dean of the School of Public Health. Jeanette Wing was, at that time, the Director of the Columbia University Data Science Institute. Gary Miller is a Vice Dean, and Kyros Perhane obviously is PI of the grant, or one of the PIs of this grant, and the Chair of the Biostatistics Department at Columbia. And the reason that I'm pointing that out is that there were a lot of different levels here where we were trying to describe what data science was and where data science was going. There was sort of assistant professor in biostatistics, associate professor in biostatistics, chair, vice dean, dean, and then sort of somebody at a university level. And all of this sort of, I think, shaped the perspectives that went into this. We had to sort of come up with a way to think about what data science was that sort of was reasonable across that entire spectrum of people who were sort of really engaged in doing data science, and then sort of school and university level leaders in doing data science. And there was sort of a lot of back and forth around this. I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, just what do I do in data science. some of the work that I do as a biostatistician, the research I sort of think of as very much doing data science. I do functional data analysis, which is a version of high dimensional data where you have adjacency in time. I sort of think of this as like a Fitbit. You have an observation every minute of the day and you want to do statistics over that sort of entire domain, building in something like temporal smoothness. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about today, but I do sort of methods development in that direction. I also teach now a fairly large class, and this class that I teach is going to be one of the things that Tiffany and I used when we put together the short course for later today. The class that I teach is focused on training in-this level biostatisticians in tools for doing data science work. And the tools for doing data science work is sort of focused, as we'll see, on the idea of if somebody hands you a spreadsheet, what are you going to do with it, right? At a very practical and practical-oriented level. That class is now taught to about 200 students each year. Many of those students are in the biostatistics department, but by no means are all of them in the biostatistics department. We have people coming over from EHS and EPI fairly often. There are people across the medical campus and occasionally outside of that. And I think the reason that I bring that up is because this idea that there needs to be some practical training in how you work with data is, I think, very powerful for addressing what students want. People come and take this class because they think it's going to be relevant for them in getting jobs and in their careers moving forward. So both the work that I do as a researcher and the way that I teach this class, I think, is informed by this analogy for what I think data science is. And the analogy, this is something that I learned on Twitter, although I don't remember exactly where. The analogy that I think works for how I think about data science is the following. If you think about technology that was available for human transportation in the 1910s, there was both a very cutting-edge technology that was available to almost nobody. There were a few people here who had access to a technology that many people did not. This is the first flight. But there was also transportation that was becoming, that had been a niche technology, but was now becoming very, very widely available. This is sort of the Model T rolling off the assembly line. Neither one of these I think of as more impactful or more powerful than the other. They're both sort of transformative in some sense, but one of them is about developing something that is very, very advanced and narrowly focused, and the other is about bringing some technology that had been previously difficult, making that very, very available in a broad way. And so the way that I think about this is sort of cutting-edge methods in AI and complex data analysis and things like this, where you really need rich data sets and a lot of real complexity. Things like this I think of as like ggplot, a tool that makes it possible for a lot of people to build graphics in a way that is maybe not super easy at the outset, but it makes that technology available to a lot of people. And I think that can be carried forward in a useful way to data science. And you can sort of always see, technology advances. Eventually, what had been a cutting-edge thing becomes widely available, and there's sort of a new forefront. I find that to be a useful sort of analogy. All right, so I've talked quite a bit already about data science, or said the term data science an awful lot, but I haven't actually said what data science is. And I'm going to give you two definitions, and at the outset, I'm going to tell you that I actually don't like either of these definitions. I'm going to try to explain why that is. The first of these definitions is that data science is the study of extracting value from data. This definition comes pretty much verbatim from Jeanette Wing, one of the co-authors on the paper who had been the director of the Data Science Institute. And I guess I understand where this definition comes from, especially from the perspective of somebody who leads a data science institute that draws on resources across an entire university. And in that sense, this is, I think, the most wide-ranging, the broadest definition of data science that's possible, right? And the idea here is almost that anything, if you look at this definition, almost anything that uses data in any way becomes data science. And I think in some ways that's a fair thing to say. I think it's certainly, if you're trying to sort of come up with a data science institute that has the broadest reach possible, that makes sense. But it's also a definition that I think doesn't sharpen anything. It doesn't define any boundaries around what data science is. It doesn't say, this counts as data science and this doesn't. It's just anything that involves data is data science. And in some ways, I feel a little bit uneasy about that. As somebody who, I've been doing biostatistics for an awful long time, and I think of some of the things that I do as a biostatistician in data science and some of them not. And I don't exactly know where to draw that line, but I sort of feel like there is one. The next definition, and this is closer to what I use, what we use in the paper and what I use in the class that I teach. I actually like this definition more. Says that data science is the study of formulating and rigorously answering questions using a data-centric process that emphasizes clarity, reproducibility, effective communication, and ethical practices. The thing that I like about this definition more is that it sort of builds in a lot of the things that I actually do as a data scientist, right? I sort of think of not just getting data and then analyzing it, but collaborating with people about what are the questions that we should be asking, how can we gather data that goes along with that, what is the process that we need to use to get that data, to do data analysis in a way that I feel comfortable with and as like a reproducible researcher wanting to be able to make data and code publicly available so that everybody can see the work that I've done in a very transparent way. There's an awful lot about this definition that I think really does describe what I do as a data scientist. The reason that I don't like this definition is that it also described what I would be doing as a biostatistician in 2010. And it would describe what people in computer science were doing in 2005. It describes what people who worked with data in a lot of different ways had been doing for a very long time. And so in that sense, if this definition worked for a whole bunch of disciplines right up until 2012, it doesn't explain anything about where data science came from. Why is data science important? Why are we in this room thinking about data science? Right? And I think that challenge for me is one of the reasons that defining data science, I think, is not especially a useful thing. Well, I'll say not an especially useful thing to do. I had not come up with a definition of data science that both explains what data science is and also differentiates it from, say, biostatistics in 2010. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So to sort of clarify or maybe talk a little bit more about this, I'm going to tell a story about a statistics conference that I went to in the ISI, International Statistics Institute. This is 2017, so a little bit after data science had sort of like come to the forefront, but before it was very well established. And what we're seeing here is Hadley Wickham. Hadley Wickham is the chief science officer at our studio, and he sort of was a driving force behind both our studio and the Tidyverse collection of tools and a whole bunch of other stuff. And he was the keynote speaker at ISI, and he was sort of talking about his approach to developing these tools for doing data science. And I could go on a digression about like what it was exactly he was saying, but more or less he was sort of describing what he thought data science was and how one might go about doing data science. And he got done with his talk, and remember this is 2017 at a big statistics conference, and one of actually the very first question that came from the audience was, what is the point of talking about data science? Aren't we already doing data science? And I think the reaction to that question was really telling in the sense that half of the audience clapped. Everybody thought like, yes, you're exactly right, we're already doing data science, there's no need for this new term to be floating around. And the other half of the audience thought it was the most ridiculous thing that they had ever heard, right? The question itself, I think, was sort of very polarizing, that some group of people thought, yes, I'm doing data science already, this is just rebranding statistics or computer science or whatever I've been doing for my whole career. And the other group of people thought like, no, this is something that's actually completely different. And Hattie's response, roughly, this is not a direct quote, and I haven't like gone back and double checked, was something like, a data scientist is a statistician who's useful, which I think was maybe a deliberately provocative thing to say. It was definitely, it got a reaction, and the reaction was that, the first half of the people who had like thought, yes, we're already doing data science, they were now all very upset with Hadley, and the other people were, of course, very, very excited about this. I think, like looking back on that, I think it's important to remember that like data science emerged over time in a setting where a lot of people were viewing this and thinking like, well, I'm already doing a lot of the things that data science says it's doing. I've been doing that for my whole career, and I don't understand where this new term has come from, why it's important, what it means about the work that I've done up to this point. And so the thing that I want to emphasize again is that is a very, very understandable question. And here I guess I had the year wrong. I've had the year wrong for quite a bit. But in 2022, right now, while we're sort of all invested in the idea of data science as a discipline, I think it's easy to forget how prevalent that question was, that there was a real identity crisis, certainly among statisticians and biostatisticians, and I sort of think by extension, although I don't know, among, say, computer scientists and engineers and others, who work in very technical disciplines and are engaged in a lot of the things that data science says it wants to do, but had they been doing that for their whole careers anyways, right? And so explaining where data science came from, I think, was a real challenge. And this, from roughly 2017, this is a screenshot from the JSM, the Joint Statistical Meeting, had a session on the statistics identity crisis that was sort of centered around this idea of, is statistics even a discipline anymore? Or are we all sort of absorbed by data science? Like, where are we going and what are we doing at this point? And this session, the YouTube of a statistics session has tens of thousands of views now. That's what I think sort of speaks to the idea that this was a really powerful question for a long time. So one of the things that we do sort of put into the paper is something like the following. And this is, I think, for me, an explanation of where data science actually came from. And it really is focused on the idea that data science emerged in parallel to other things that were going on in science generally. And the things that were going on in science generally were things like the emergence and the reliance on big data. The idea that we're going to be able to get data from a lot of different sources and pull it all together, and that's going to be a useful and powerful thing. And that anybody who's working with data potentially needs to have some facility with big data. It's not all data is going to be big data, but enough of it is that you sort of need to be aware of that as something that could happen. Sort of in parallel to the emergence of big data, there was this new emphasis on prediction. And roughly speaking, the idea is, you know, if we have rich data on a huge number of people, we ought to be able to make very focused predictions about individuals. And you can sort of think of this in public health or in medicine as the idea of doing precision health. If I have genetics and genomics and exposures on everybody, I should be able to get that in and make some very concrete predictions about individuals. This sort of third line here is the reproducibility crisis in science. And I think not entirely, but to some degree this gets traced back to that Ioannidis paper where he said, most published research is false, which I don't believe really at all, but it was a very big deal in science generally. And the idea was that if you did the same study again, would it replicate? And that's a high bar to set, but a somewhat lower bar is, could I even reproduce the results that you published in the first place? And that reproducibility idea, I think, was very powerful, that in the interest of making science more transparent and hopefully more correct over time, that people should, in general, be making data and code publicly available for all of the work that they do. And I think that was sort of a very powerful idea. There's also a lot of emphasis on interdisciplinary research, the idea that to do effective science in a wide variety of areas, it's not going to be enough for there to be a data scientist or a cardiologist or a whatever, that really making advances in science is going to rely on close collaboration across a variety of disciplines. And so you need to have some ability to work with others in a very interdisciplinary and team-oriented way. This last bullet point, or sorry, the fifth bullet point, I think is a little bit different, but it's important to get lumped into this in the sense that it doesn't, I think, have anything to do with working with data specifically or reproducibility or something like this. But a lot of the people who were very passionate about the first of these things, about addressing things that had to do with reproducibility, about understanding big data and doing prediction accuracy, those were the same people for whatever reason. Maybe it was sort of generational, maybe it was because they were sort of interested in this in the first place. I think the people who were interested in addressing some of those first concerns were sort of thinking to themselves like, well, if we're going to fix all of this stuff in science also, we should also be concerned about diversity and equity and inclusion, that these are real things that science hasn't done well for a long time, and if we're going to be concerned about fixing science in general and using data more effectively, maybe we can sort of be concerned about this as well. And one of the things that I think was evidence for this is especially I guess I'm most familiar with like the data science community that's oriented around biostatistics and R and things like this. I think those communities very early on made a point of having codes of conduct at seminars and making sure that the speaker lineups were diverse and inclusive. I think, like, again, it's hard to say exactly where this fits in, but it seems to me obviously true that became an integral part of data science early on. The sixth bullet point is, again, like one of these things that I think is most closely related to reproducibility, is that if you're going to talk about things being reproducible in general, it shouldn't just be that if a researcher emails me that I can provide them the code. It's that everything that I do in some sense should be very public, should be available to everyone, and the best way to do that is to disseminate as much as possible in an online platform. And the last 2 points here, again, I want to drive home most of this stuff. It's not like any of this was new in 2012, which is what I'm sort of thinking of as the start of data science. All of this existed in the scientific community. All of these were things that people were talking about, but I think they all kind of coalesced into a framework that fell under this broad umbrella of data science. That people started, when you started hearing the term data science, what was implied by that was this collection of concerns rather than any concrete definition. So I think that connotation, like what people think when you say data science, is I think what the important part of data science is. I still don't think I could write down any definition of data science that works, but I think everybody, when you say data science, like has a sense of what that means. And different people will weigh different parts of that more. Some people will think, data science is all about reproducibility, and other people will think data science is all about machine learning and AI. But it has some connotation, and understanding what that connotation is and what people mean by it is I think, really important to it. I know the most about statistics and biostatistics, and sort of, I don't want to say what the reaction to this was in computer science or elsewhere, but definitely in biostatistics, this argument over data science mapped onto things that had already been going on, right? In statistics, in biostatistics, there are sort of not hard divisions, but definitely separations between people who are a little bit more theoretical and people who are a little bit more applied. And this emergence of data science, I think, sort of fell into that very nicely, where the more applied folks it was easier for them to gravitate towards this idea of data science as something new and relevant to the work that they were doing. And I know definitely early on that's sort of where that split came from in the audience at ISI, was who were the statisticians who sort of felt like this was a new thing that they wanted to gravitate to, and who were the statisticians who thought, like, all of this is what I've been doing, with good reason, that like all of this is stuff that has mattered to statistics for a really long time. I think, I don't know, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that the emergence of data science for a lot of people felt like a validation, that if you were an applied statistician who for a long time had felt like the statistics community valued things that were different from what you put work into, that you cared about reproducibility, and that was something that statistics for a long time had said as a community, we do really care about, but that wasn't acted upon in some ways. That I think the sort of emergence of data science suggested that the stated values of some disciplines were different from the actual values of those disciplines. And I guess another way to say this is the gap between thinking, I don't understand where data science comes from, and I don't know where data science comes from because I feel like that's already what I'm doing. I think the gap between those is a gap that sort of suggests that there were things that statistics and computer science and other disciplines thought were important but weren't really acting on, right? And I know in 2012 for myself that I thought reproducibility was important, but it wasn't something that I had to do to submit papers, so it sort of like fell by the wayside. And I think that was true for a lot of folks. So I think, I think that's just sort of one of the ways where data science came into being. In general, I think this emergence of data science, hopefully what it would mean is that disciplines would see, these things matter not just to our community, but to science more generally. And so if whole groups of people are now very concerned about using big data and about reproducibility and things like this, well then great, we need to become more oriented around that ourselves. We need to bring the values of our field that look like what data science is, we need to bring all of that into somewhat closer alignment. And I think that has been happening, and I can say again more about this in statistics than I can say in other disciplines, but I think that has been happening, right? That there is sort of across scientific disciplines more awareness around ideas for equity and inclusion. There's broader view of what kinds of work is important and a greater emphasis on interdisciplinary research. In biostatistics and what we're going to talk about later today, in things that are like data science, things about how you work with data and how you incorporate reproducibility, all of that is now, I think, more explicitly taught, rather than being something that you maybe pick up along the way if you have time to do it. Okay. So all of that is to say, right, I sort of started out with these two definitions of what data science is, and I didn't especially like either of them. I think if I had to pick one, I think Jeanette is probably more right in defining data science. And what I mean by that is, if you think about data science as sort of defining in a connotation at least of having some collection of ideas that matter to people in data-oriented domains, then having the broadest possible collection of domains is probably very important. That we want to sort of think of data science as something that is establishing a collection of values that we share as scientists, as data scientists, and that should be really cross-cutting. It should go into whatever discipline anybody who is working with data might exist in. And so I think one of the ways that is going to persist is that data science in some sense will be like a secondary academic identity, right? I sort of think of myself, I think I probably do a lot of data science, but I think of myself very often as a biostatistician first and like a public health data scientist in addition to that. And I think a lot of other people will sort of think of themselves in that same way, that like, I do data science and I am a data scientist, but my primary training is in this, and the sort of field that I am most comfortable in is computer science or mathematics or something like this. And then, right, so I think this maximalist definition of data science is going to sort of win out in the sense that some definition, if you tried to come up with a definition that said like, this is data science and how it differs from statistics and computer science and engineering and mathematics and it's a separate discipline, I really have a hard time imagining that definition is going to exist. And instead there will be, in each of those disciplines, there will be people who are more closely aligned with data science and less closely aligned with data science. Okay, so I spent a lot of time talking about where data science came from without ever once talking about public health data science. And I think the sort of transition to what public health data science is relatively direct from this point, in the sense that public health data science is doing all of those things, but with the goal that is slightly different, a goal that is more focused on advancing health and well-being. But beyond that, I think, to the extent that this narrow definition works, I think public health data science sort of fits neatly within that. One of the things that I like about this sort of thinking about what public health data science is and how it works is that data science is this sort of very, very broad idea will both contribute to what different disciplines are doing, but also learn from those different disciplines. That what data science is will sort of be constantly evolving as a collection of best practices or a collection of values that the scientific community cares about, and it's going to draw on all of those existing domains. What I like about that is that public health data scientists, what we're attempting to do, that will learn from what sort of data science as a broader field might be interested in, but it will also contribute back to what that broader field is interested in. And I think that contributing back, especially for public health, is something that I think about a lot and care about a lot. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But I guess sort of like, before getting there, I'm going to make a few like very easy, I think, predictions about public health data science. Because I think it is so closely related to just regular data science, it's going to follow a very similar trajectory in the sense that, for a while folks are saying data science is just statistics, data science is just machine learning, data science is just this. I think there will be a time period in which in public health people say the same thing. And actually that might have already happened and passed in the sense that, in 2018 and 2019 I saw, folks on Twitter, public health data science is just epidemiology, or public health data science is just this. I think it wasn't true for data science, and it's not going to be true for public health data science either, so that will pass. I think that there are going to be a lot of people who, in public health, think of themselves as public health data scientists, but do that as a secondary domain, that they sort of think of themselves as biostatisticians or environmental health researchers or epidemiologists or something first, and public health data scientists second. But there will be a lot of people who are public health data scientists outside of academia. And one of the things that came up a lot yesterday and we have to think about is what does it mean if we're defining public health data science or training people for public health data science, that we're going to have academic grounding in tools and techniques in public health, but we also have to have some professional orientation around this, that we need to be training people for a workforce in some sense. So why do I think that the public health piece in this is important, and where do I think of public health as contributing back to data science more generally? One of the, I think working in public health for a very long time has meant looking at observational data that is somewhat messy, and that in addition relies on, or sort of all built around the idea that you are working with and for communities, with and for people. And so I think because of that, both the data that exists in public health and also the goals of public health. There are some things that are long-standing traditions in public health that maybe have not been long-standing traditions in mathematics or computer science or engineering. And what I mean by that is thinking carefully about who is represented in a sample, what are the selection biases, what are the measurement process, who gets lost, what do you lose, what assumptions do you make, all of these sort of things that are pillars of understanding what's going on in a public health study that certainly is true in other domains, but is really, really present here. There's always in public health this tension between wanting to infer causation and the difficulty in doing that from available data. And I think all of the work in public health that has been done on causal inference is certainly becoming more generally interesting. Public health has always been a very interdisciplinary research domain. It's impossible to do public health work if you are only doing, maybe not impossible, it's difficult to do public health work if you're gathering information on individuals but not analyzing that in an appropriate way, or to be coming up with biostatistical methods that are not grounded in some real public health problem. Because public health data has always been human subjects research, there is a real grounding in data ethics, the idea that both data collection has to be fair and equitable, and also what data gets used has to be fair and equitable. And then thinking about the goals of that research is something that should advance health. I think that's something that, again, is a pillar of public health data science and has been for a long time, and is going to be important for data science more generally moving forward. And then this last bullet point, connecting, not exactly to reproducibility, but in making things public. If you're doing public health work, at some point you have to engage with a community. You have to have some dialogue with stakeholders who are going to be interested in understanding what your research means for them as individuals or for them as a community. And so that public dissemination and the back and forth, I think, has been really present in public health for a really long time. This figure that I include, I think, just again reiterates some of the ideas that are central in public health, that you may be interested in measuring something, but there's a lot of steps before you get to the actual data that you've collected. And you may be interested in understanding something about a particular population, but there's a lot of steps before you get to the data that you actually have in front of you. All of this has been true in public health for a very, very long time, and I think it's going to be increasingly relevant to understand that in public health, in data science more generally. And I think, I know I've been talking a little bit quickly, but I think that's actually the end of my slides, and that should leave us a few minutes for discussion, at least a little bit of time for reaction. So I'm very interested to hear what folks think, and then we'll take a break and get started with the show for us.
Too clear, probably. Yeah.
So thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciate it. And I want to ask a small clarification. So data science should be like a practical training, most of the things we do. And then, so I was asking about this class you're teaching currently is very popular, which is having 200 students. So I know that the course you teach is a very practical course. So how do you go about making sure that the students get the right practical skills, like within the time frame of the class? How do you go about that?
So how do I go about making sure that students in the class that I teach get the right practical skills? So I think there are a few things that I take advantage of. One of them is that I recognize that the course that I teach exists within a much broader curriculum, and in that sense I remind students fairly often that I expect that they're learning how to do t-tests and regression and clustering and whatever other data analysis methods are necessary. I assume that they're learning that somewhere else. And I assume that they're learning things about epidemiology and social determinants of health and a variety of other things, that all of that stuff is very important to being well-rounded and successful public health data scientists, but that they're going to learn that somewhere else. So I really do try to define the scope of the class that I'm teaching very narrowly as whatever analysis you're going to do is going to exist in this part of your data analysis, but the steps that come before that, from when somebody sends you a spreadsheet, and the steps that come after that to how you're going to make your data products publicly available, those are the things that I'm most interested in teaching in this class. I think I was very deliberate in deciding which tools I would choose to teach, and a lot of that has to, a lot of that I think the stuff that I teach was not available in 2012, right? That our studio didn't really exist in 2012, and the Tidyverse didn't exist in 2012. And so teaching a collection of tools that were originally intended to make data analysis easy, and then choosing to teach those tools very specifically, I think makes it possible to cover kind of a lot of ground to say, this is all of the stuff that I think it's important for you to learn at this point. And you'd be surprised. You can actually really cover, I think, a lot of ground, making it possible for a lot of messy data to get imported and then cleaned up and turned into user-friendly graphics and disseminated online, all in a relatively quick time frame. Yes?
Thank you, Jeff, and it was a nice presentation or discussion. So I have two points where I would like you to reflect on. The first is, we know that data science is applied in multiple fields, in education and business, and every sector has its own unique way of looking into data and processing the data. So if you might reflect on how the field of public health by itself help to advance data science in terms of the need for a different way of data processing or a need for different kind of modeling of, so the algorithms are going to actually emanate from the business. So if you reflect on that. The other one, from your last point, how can we see data science detached from the tools and the platforms that we use today, because we know that after a couple of years we might have a totally different landscape. So how do we see data science as a field detached from the tools that we use today?
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. Thank you. I think for the first, how is public health data science going to contribute in domains like finance or in business or in other areas where data science is clearly relevant, but maybe what public health does is somewhat less so. And I think, for me, that sort of goes back to the idea of, to a much greater degree, recognizing where data come from, right? And I guess sort of, maybe in business there's, this is bold, I don't know all that much about business, if I'm honest, so please forgive me if what I'm saying is not relevant. The way that I sort of think about how public health is important there is to think about, in some financial data set, you may have outcomes that you're interested in on some collection of people. And I think recognizing more and more that what outcomes you have, whether or not those are actual indicators of the things that you care about, right? If financial output or income or something is a reasonable marker for what you care about, is the measurement that you're getting, the data that you have, is that really measuring the phenomenon that you're interested in? Or is it sort of a loose construct, or sorry, a surrogate for the construct that you actually care about? And then also, what data do you have available to you? Are you actually getting information on all of the people who you are interested in making some conclusion about? Or is it you have financial data that is relevant to a particular subset? I think that thought process is maybe one way that I would think of a public health perspective as being relevant in finance. I think the other way, maybe, and this is sort of, again, not something that I've thought too carefully about, so please, don't, apologies if it doesn't hold up. I think the increasing shift towards understanding a causal perspective and thinking very carefully about what does it mean for some correlation to actually tell you about causation, when is that something that you can model very explicitly, and what are the assumptions you have to make? I think those are, again, things that have come up in computer science and in business and in economics for a long time, but I think it's an important public health perspective as well. For your second question, this is maybe where I feel a little bit more at home, is thinking about how we can think of data science as separate from the tools that we might use to do data analysis. I think the R and RStudio platforms are great tools for doing data science. You can do reproducible research in a whole bunch of different ways, though, and so I think it's not that you have to be using R or Python to be doing data science. I think you could use a variety of things, and there will probably be new tools that come online before long that are also very useful. What I think is important here is remembering that the principles of doing transparent research, of making sure that things are reproducible, and using tools that make that as easy as possible, I think that's sort of where I see the data science perspective as distinct from the specific tools that get used. Thanks.
So Jeff, I was going to comment on something else, but let me start about the causation issue.
Mm-hmm.
So, in fact, data science or even machine learning, AI, in its purest form when it was first developed, it wasn't even about causation, right? It was more about prediction and the ability to predict analytics and things like that. It's actually when people started thinking about statistical learning and data science in its current form, actually now that causation comes into the fore. So I think in terms of causation, actually, I don't think data science has it in the past actually as its main goal, but it's becoming more so because of this new fusion with foundational statistical principles. So I think that's probably important to point out. But then coming back to the identity of data science, I think of it as, of course any science is in a continuous state of evolution, but it's a very slow process. It's well established and then things improve over time and take new directions. But when it comes to data science and machine learning and others, to me it's actually almost like a revolution, not an evolution. And it's almost like a volcano erupted, but still hasn't cooled down, and we don't know if there's going to be new mountains or valleys or mountains will be lost. So I think all your definitions today actually are relevant and right on, but I think that probably the important point is actually that right now we are in a state of fusion. And I think our definition is going to be different from day to day, year to year, both across fields, but also over time, right? So I think of it as a relationship between mathematics and statistics many, many years ago. People were saying, we don't need a department of statistics because it's just another form of mathematics. And then between statistics and biostatistics again, people were also opposed to formation of departments of biostatistics, because it is just a branch of statistics. I think I'm seeing the same kind of resistance when it comes to data science and biostatistics or data science and statistics, and to some extent even data science and computer science, right? So in terms of the definition and the evolution, if you have a crystal ball, would we say exactly the same definitions will hold like 5 years from now or 10 years from now, once things have cooled down and the volcano has, formed whatever it's going to form in changing the landscape? Because 10 years from now, I guess, actually, that we will have probably a more concrete definition of what data science is, maybe in its different facets, right? So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I definitely understand the point, and I agree. Like, data science is all of maybe 10 years old, and the first 5 of that was nobody had any idea how to define anything related to data science. And I agree, like the definitions will probably shift. I still think that the connotation will probably be more important than any particular definition, in the sense that what data science means to people will probably be the thing that is the most relevant. I think one of the things that is an important difference between, say, statistics and mathematics, or biostatistics and statistics, is that was a branching of an individual discipline. That when statistics sort of branched from mathematics, the statisticians were more or less all within mathematics up to that point. And I think, so if I think about, say, public health data science in particular, and maybe to sort of like make this even more concrete, if I thought about, is the Mailman School of Public Health going to form a Department of Public Health Data Science, and what would that look like? I think it would require like me and Tiffany and other people in epidemiology and elsewhere to say, rather than being in biostatistics and environmental health and epidemiology, we're actually going to form a new department that is distinct from each of those things. And I don't have a crystal ball, but I have a hard time imagining that that's going to happen, right? I think that it's going to be a lot easier for data science to span disciplines and allow for individuals within those disciplines to more closely align to sort of the values that data science comes to represent, then it's going to be to sort of pick individuals off from a bunch of different disciplines and say, like, this is data science or this is public health data science. So I think that's sort of my gut reaction, is that traditional disciplines will persist and data science will sort of span a whole bunch of different areas rather than becoming like its own concrete field. But you're right, I don't know that that's how likely that is, and I don't know that I could assign a probability to one version or the other.
Well, it's a different discussion, like what we say over drinks, I guess.
Yeah.
I think I would actually see more, kind of, if there was a public health data science department, it would actually be parallel to biostatistics, but more of a fusion between biostatistics, bioinformatics, and computer science kind of principles, but without the public health orientation. But that's one formation. Again, we don't know, because as you said, it has been infused into all fields across, across the entire spectrum. So, but if I had to guess, my crystal ball tells me actually those are the three fields that will form, the new formation, if any. Right? So. Yeah, and we have, if there is more discussion, we can have, because we started a little bit late. We have half an hour of coffee and photo session, so we can, take into that, if people have comments. Because this is very important in terms of understanding what the formation of the field is.
Yes, Rahab.
This is rather a discussion probably for the group in the class, in this room. I was asked by some university professors in Ethiopia whether it is advisable to start a data science program in the for the undergraduate programs. So my immediate reaction was no, because of the experience that is required to analyze the data in terms of prediction and the related things. So I just wanted to see the reaction from the groups, because like people like from the developing countries like Ethiopia, we still do not have an idea on what to do with the big data, let alone to start undergraduate programs. So I just wanted to get some opinions. Thank you.
Just if there is nobody, then maybe one more question. Now, through time, we have been, using different kind of techniques for like data management, for transformation of data for different reasons. So would someone be wrong if it's claimed that the data visualization and the communication part is the one which is, making data science to be more significant or relatively having a new perspective of data than the other? Because using as well, we have been doing, data management using other tools as well. We have been doing transforming of data using different tools.
Yeah.
So is it the visualization and the communication part that makes it a little bit different from the rest?
So those are both really interesting questions. I think I have a hard time for myself saying much about undergraduate training, right? The Mailman School of Public Health, we teach exclusively graduate students, and so I worry that I don't have enough familiarity with undergraduate training in general to say much about whether, a data science program is possible or relevant. I guess, to the extent that you can have graduate training in statistics and also undergraduate training in statistics. I suppose that you could have graduate training in data science and undergraduate training in data science with a recognition that the level of expertise and the nuance that would go into that would be a little bit different. I think if I were going to make a recommendation about undergraduate training in data science, I would focus more on tools that have to do with data management and visualization and inferential statistics, descriptive statistics, basics of programming, things like this, rather than on advanced techniques in machine learning and other things like this. I think that combining traditional statistics and biostatistics with techniques in computer science and data management, I think that could make for a reasonable undergraduate degree program, potentially. I think it's an interesting question about whether the thing that has made data science more prevalent is like most closely related to the tools that are available. I think that I think that's something that I agree with an awful lot up to a point. And what I mean by that is I think that the practical reality of what data science means really is mostly focused on data management and visualization and traditional statistical methods, right? I think even as a data scientist, an awful lot of what I do is linear and logistic regression, right? And like it all counts, I think, as data science, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking all that much about neural networks or about advanced techniques in machine learning. It sort of doesn't come up in my own day-to-day all that much. And so I think that for a lot of people, a lot of the students who take my class, for example, and are doing an MPH in epidemiology, for them, the most important piece of data science is being able to get an Excel spreadsheet and make nice graphs and then fit a linear regression and produce those results in a clear and reproducible way. I think that's true. And in that sense, I had the figure that showed like the first flight in a Model T. I think for a lot of people, the most important part of data science is the Model T part of things, of making tools for data manipulation much more readily accessible and easy to use. That said, I think it's really difficult to stay away from the connotation of data science that is so much focused on advanced techniques and machine learning and AI. I think especially outside of, in writing grants and in raising funds, very often what comes up in data science is like artificial intelligence, right? Like it's very difficult to do fundraising around like better data management, right? So I think it's important to recognize that in a lot of ways that advanced techniques is sort of integral to the connotation of data science, the sort of aspiration of data science, but a lot of what folks really need to learn is the boots on the ground. How do you do data management and visualization? Yeah.
So can I comment a little bit? So for undergraduate, it's similar to biostatistics. Like for instance, it's very hard to have an undergraduate in biostatistics because they need to have public training, so it's almost like a graduate degree. But I was actually doing a very quick search. There is now ranking on undergraduate programs in data science, including Columbia, but places like UC Berkeley, MIT, and others. But they all reside in computer science for the most part. And because there is market, some statistics programs are also marketing data, their programs as data science. But I'm not sure whether that's purely marketing, rebranding, or real, data science programs. But I think if there is any undergraduate degree, it would be, equivalent to a statistics or bioinformatics or some other technical field. And then it's only in the graduate, postgraduate level that you will see, public health data science, for instance, right? So it sounds like that's how the evolution is.
I'm raising this question for curiosity. You have given us a very good definition for public health data science, which says public health data science is the state of formulating and rigorously answering questions, and it goes on. This definition usually resembles the definition we have been using for defining research and similar concepts. I am wondering if you have come across with the philosophical grounding of data science, so while you are writing this paper.
When you say philosophical grounding of data science, do you mean separate from like the definition of data science or the goal of data science?
Yeah, what's underlying data science? Otherwise, the problem is without having solid philosophical grounding, later on considering it as a discipline or as a field of study will be difficult. I've been exploring along this issue and trying to make sense of the philosophy behind, really going through this, the definition you have given us even throughout my reading in this domain.
I haven't got a clear philosophical grounding. That is my problem.
Yeah, well, I think that is a fair point, right? And I think this sort of gets back to something that Kiros said, is that data science is sort of rapidly evolving. And for me, at least, I think it's much easier to describe what data science seems to be today, describe how it came to be an important topic in public health and in science more broadly. To think about like why are we thinking about data science today? And to me, that is that collection of values that data science has come to connote, if not like represent as a distinct discipline. I don't know that I could sit down and say this is the philosophy of a data scientist, and partly that's because I think data science is still a little bit in flux, and partly that's because I'm not sure that I could write down the philosophy of biostatistics myself either. Maybe I'm just not sort of a philosophically minded person. I think for me it's easier to sort of think about how data science is operationalized, and how it's operationalized in a way that is distinct from traditional biostatistics or traditional computer science or traditional mathematics or something like this. So, I think this is a long-winded way of saying, like, I don't know if I could tell you what the philosophy of data science is, other than sort of the combination of definition and connotation that I've given up to this point. And that's, for me, I think that is enough to think of data science as a real, if not discipline, then a real organizing thought, organizing force in science generally. I don't know if others have thoughts about this. I know Patrick has been waiting to ask a question for a while.
My mic is very fast. You can make it better. Super. I think because I'm sitting at the extreme end, I think I need the mic. So, first of all, let me just, thank Jeff. This is a wonderful presentation, and I captured maybe half of it, and that's quite useful. And I was thrown away just to have a short meeting, but thank you very, very much. Now, I know data science is evolving, and for us, we are concentrating more at the master's level. I have seen also that there are DSI projects that concentrate on the PhD level, and also postdoc. And so it is important that there are groups that are thinking about the masters, the PhD, and postdoc in data science. With respect to the undergraduate programs in data science, I think these are, for us in Kenya, is something that is allowed. And it all depends on the tools that they bring forth. It all depends on the supporting courses that they bring forth, from statistics, from mathematics, and from biostatistics. Now, you consider the definition of data science, and whichever way you look at it, whichever definition you bring forth, there will be something missing. And I think this is the strength of data science. If you are able to agree on one particular definition, then it will be a straitjacket kind of course that would be common all over the world based on that definition. And the fact that we cannot agree on one kind of definition makes this program, makes data science be something that is not easy to explain, and therefore the academicians, the researchers, the teachers of data science will then bring different tools to explain the same thing. And I think this is, I've seen even in other courses, that this then becomes a strength. Now, so you find a number of programs that at the end of it, the graduates will be required to have some aspects of data science, tools that then explain more of the data mining, the data analysis, the data visualization. And so, in my considered view, if a university proposes an undergraduate, a BSc in data science, well and good. You will find programs that will talk about data science and applied statistics. I think the name would be confusing, but the most important thing is what details do they have in the program. Coming back to our public health data science, again I can tell you that even that one, the name is confusing to a lot of people. And so one set of people will say, we are actually concentrating on health, on public health, and just using the data science tools in public health. Then there's another group that believe that we are strengthening, we are looking at the evolution of data science, but then, bringing data from the public health sector to be able to explain more of these tools. And I think that is where maybe I need you to address. Of the two groups, what is it that we should stress on more? Is it building on the public health models, and then of course using data science to explain that, or strengthening the data science tools and using public health data to explain these tools? I think that is something that we could discuss more as a group. Thank you.
So I think there were a lot of really insightful points in there. Yes, it seems like there is an interest in thinking about undergraduate training programs in data science and in public health data science, and I think that's a worthwhile thing to consider. Again, I think I would view that roughly in a way that parallels our development of master's programs in public health data science, with the idea being that there needs to be well-rounded training in tools used for data analysis, traditional methods for doing data analysis that are traditional because they work extremely well in a wide variety of settings, as well as some of the newer techniques in machine learning, especially those that have ideally some reasonable interpretations and the ability to have useful implementations that can be adapted by a wide variety of folks. But I think if one were going to think about an undergraduate program in data science or in public health data science, I think it would sort of have to be grounded in a way that's similar to what we've done so far here. Your question about is public health data science sort of taking data science and applying it to public health, or is it grounded in public health and drawing on some new techniques for data science? I think that's a very good question, and one that I don't know that I have a complete answer to. My personal feeling is that public health data science, and this I think is absolutely biased by the fact that I have been in public health for since I was a graduate student, to me, the important part in public health data science is the public health part of things, and that a lot of the training that we do in public health data science is focused on understanding what public health is about, what are the determinants of health, and what are the ways that we gather information on individuals, and how do we learn about health behaviors and what affects outcomes for populations that we care about. I think it also depends on traditional methods in epidemiology and biostatistics to a very large degree. But it's also important for us to recognize that our work as public health practitioners can be improved by learning from disciplines that haven't been traditional partners. That we can learn from computer science, and we can learn from informatics, and we can learn from engineering, and at best, understand what those strengths are and apply them in settings that we care about in a way that is still sort of grounded in public health practice, but it makes the work that we do better in some measurable way. And I also think that that sort of flow of information is bidirectional in the sense that I think data science will become better by having sort of public health data scientists contributing to that community and explaining what it is we care about in public health and why that's relevant to data science more broadly.
I think it's time for a break, I guess.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeff. This was really inspiring.
Thanks.
Can I say something really quick?
Sure.
So, as we are enjoying break, I'm going to be coming around to some of you to gather some information for COVID tests, as well as take your order for dinner this evening, if you are planning to come to Sippers with the team. We hope everyone can join us. So, Otino asked that we kind of pre-order. So, this FYI, I'll be coming around.
So as of for this it says break, but also says photo session. Should we do it at the end of the day, or should we need a picture of the short-term training?
Right. Should we make it
For the next part, is it possible to have like a microphone on a stand? Yeah, so that I can type and speak at the same time. I think yesterday there was a microphone on podium, or was there not?
Okay, so here's a menu to look at for the dinner. So, like appetizer, main course. So I'll send it. I'll stick it over. You're joining us, right? You're going to join us for dinner, right? Let's You're going to join us at Sippers, right?
Need me to hold them back? Oh, maybe your podium? Yeah.
The podium microphone.
On it.
Patrick didn't tell you? No. Oh, really? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought you had communicated that invitation. Okay, sure. Sorry for the short notice. I thought everyone already knew about this.
Yeah. Just give us
Sure, no problem. No, it's, I don't know where it is. But Patrick chose it. I think it's a nice restaurant. Yeah.
It's as near as
Like, or are you still deciding?
I think we want to discuss something.
No problem. Okay. Oh, Tino, welcome.
Oh, you have not seen him? We came in together. Oh, thank you.
It's only that I want to drop the coffee when
Yeah, that's why.
Okay.
health break now?
Yes.
Or are we having coffee break?
Well, you may have both at the same time.
You know they are twins.
So I'll bring the paper. You can put your appetizer and your main course. Okay?
Yeah, but you can't.
Everyone is invited. Okay, some of them are surprised. That's okay.
That's not Can I try it?
Oh, hii ni ile where are we? Sorry to God. But it is
America, it's like there's a south.
yeah, I think that's better so that
You're on the next page. Okay? This is great. So we're done.
You can walk. Ready to go.
Let's see. Maybe.
so it is in
This part goes.
So it's just. Oh, and it's afternoon too.
Yeah, so we have like a bit of lunch and we have an afternoon session.
All right.
I'm seeing all the nice things you
No, there is alipia kidogo. Alipia hiyo
That means to be the basic. They're doing the basic.
the basic will go to one, but
By the point is the.
but we cannot be training ourselves for free.
But that's why they have given it only them is good.
Oh, you opted for the fast water. Oh, yeah.
There was also a language.
It's actually a real bottle.
Yeah, this is the one from October. Yeah, right.
I'm joking.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't have
I just always thirsty.
So it's always good to stay hydrated.
I feel like I'm a water snob. Grabbing all my water.
Did you do your city?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're like not that much.
Yeah. No, it's great. Although it's a little coordinated. It's not like just, it is a little more.
So you like hot water?
What?
What do you like? City water?
The city water.
Just
The
hot water.
beer
Yeah,
tap.
yeah, it's really good. It's actually very good. Yeah.
There's a little more. There's a touch. Yeah.
The town of Rochelle, city for
amazing professor he did an undergraduate class in, I don't know what department it's in, but and I
what we wanted to talk about today. So I'm going to like present stuff, and if you have questions as we go, Tiffany is here to sort of like troubleshoot as we go. I did encourage everybody to bring a laptop so that we can all sort of follow along, but this is intended to be a very interactive kind of a session. The motivation for this came from a suggestion actually that came up in one of our weekly meetings not too long ago. Darby suggested that a good use of this short course time would be to introduce some of the platforms, some of the tools that we're going to be using in courses throughout the MS programs, and so that's what we're going to be trying to do today. Does this sound good? Okay, so there's a few things, and we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. We may not get through everything, given our goal to sort of stay on time, but we'll get through as many of these things as possible. The first place that we're going to get started is in this Getting Started collection of slides, and actually maybe I'll switch over to PowerPoint and just show this. The goal, like I say, for the short course in general is to introduce some of the common tools that I have found are very useful for doing data science, right? And this goes back to some of the stuff that came up earlier. There are a lot of different ways that one can actually do data science and do reproducible research. The reason that I use these tools in particular is related to that, the image that I showed of Hadley Wickham giving a presentation. Most of the things that Hadley and others at RStudio have designed, the underlying philosophy is to try to make the tools encourage best practices as much as possible. So if you're using things like RStudio and R Markdown and Tidyverse and other things like this, it is often the case that your code is going to be clearer and your analysis is going to be more reproducible, sort of by accident, just because those are the tools you're using and that's sort of what is encouraged along the way. So that's why we're using these things. What we're going to talk about today is RStudio, a few like very quick tips that is like very much related to my own personal preferences, and then I'll sort of introduce R Markdown, how it works, and we'll sort of see how this goes. I guess just so that I know at the outset, how many people are like very familiar with all of these things already? Does everybody like use RStudio and R Markdown at the outset? Everybody? Most people? Does anybody sort of not use these? Okay, so I think it'll be relatively quick, but I'll try to introduce some of this stuff. And then I'll talk a little bit about project organization and in particular our projects. So I really do like RStudio. The idea for RStudio is, in general, like I say, to make the tools that one uses for doing data analysis consistent with the best practices for doing data science. That if you're sitting down in front of RStudio and you're using R Markdown and you're using other tools like this, very often you will end up doing analysis that is more reproducible and more transparent to others, and also easier to distribute in online formats. And there are a variety of reasons that that's the case. There's a lot of the stuff that I like about RStudio that we're not really going to have a chance to talk about today. Some of the stuff that I like is the very close like Git and GitHub infrastructure. There's a nice connection there, so if you want to use version control, that's really possible. I'll introduce this idea of R projects, which I think are very helpful for organizing the way that you might think about a data analysis in general. But this is one of the reasons that I think R is really helpful and RStudio is really helpful, is that there's this integrated development environment where I sit down in front of my computer, and if I'm going to do a data analysis, I just open up RStudio, and that's like really all that I have to have. It's all sort of in one place. The piece on this slide that I'm going to draw attention to is this piece here in the middle about using a naming convention. I think everybody has written enough code to know that like code is case sensitive and you have to define variables and you do things like this. One of the things that I think is really helpful in making code clear is to establish a way that you're going to name variables and objects and even files and directories and everything else. And the one that I use, the one that's sort of become relatively standard in R over the last few years, especially people who are using Tidyverse tools, is this first one, the snake case convention, where things are generally lowercase and words are separated by underscores. And I'm saying this only because it's like going to be something that I use, and I used to just name variables whatever came to mind, and actually, for me, adopting a very consistent naming convention was one of the things that made all of my code clearer to me, and I think clearer to others. One of the conceptual things that I think underpins an awful lot of data science, and isn't unique to R or RStudio or anything like this, is the idea that if you're doing data analysis, the thing that you're actually producing isn't the result, it isn't the model that's being fit, it's not the figure that you're producing. What you're actually producing is the code, right? That what you sit down and the thing that you author is not a figure, the thing that you author is the code that you write. And the reason that I think that that's important is because it emphasizes that code as a means of communication and something that I think, it sort of contains authorship. That's where sort of the intellectual input goes. It's also, if you have the code and the data, you can reproduce any of the figures, you can reproduce any of the outputs, you can reproduce anything. If I'm sitting down and all of a sudden, like, everybody erased all of the figures that I had, I don't especially care because I can always, like, click a button and reproduce everything that goes along with that. If I lose my code, that's a real problem because it would take a long, long time to regenerate the code that produces the figures and things like this. And so, like, the conceptual piece here that gets back again to a question that was raised earlier, the idea here of thinking about the code as the thing that you have produced is, I think, a really important data science concept that can be used across any of these programming languages. The reason that I sort of emphasize R Markdown as a tool for doing reproducible analysis is that I think code is a very fundamental way of doing communication. It's sort of really, if somebody asks, what did you actually do? The most complete answer for that is to make the code available to that person. But code by itself is usually not informative enough. There's always a need for text that goes along with this. So a lot of the time that I spend working on data analysis, whether it's just for me or it's something that I'm going to share with collaborators or somebody else, it's very important to, like, write some text that goes along with all of those things. And R Markdown makes it possible for you to combine text and code into a single document so that you have both the words that describe the things that you did and the code that actually does it all in one place. Everything that I've set up to this point doesn't actually depend on R or on R Markdown, right? The how you name your variables and how you treat your code, that applies whatever platform you're using. The reason that I like R and the reason that I like R Markdown is because it encourages this viewpoint and it encourages the ability to combine code and text all in the same place. So for folks, maybe you know what R Markdown is and maybe not. The way R Markdown works is that it is a Markdown language. And what Markdown means is that you can write text and you can do basic formatting of that text in a way that gets translated to some downstream document. And so what we're going to see is that, you can write some text and you can include very basic formatting like bold and italics and section headings, and you can format tables and things like this. So Markdown is just a way of saying, you write text and you annotate it in some way, and that gets translated into formatted text down the road. What R Markdown does is it allows you to include in that the code that you have written to do some data analysis. So you can have text with formatting and sections and structure and whatever you like. You can also have code that then produces results. It makes tables that can be included in your document. It makes figures that can be included in your document and so on. And so R Markdown, R sort of compiles code and text to produce a Markdown file, and that Markdown file then gets translated to HTML or to a Word document or to a PDF or to whatever else. And so the overall process is you write an R Markdown thing and then you knit that to a traditional Markdown document, and that gets converted to whatever file format you're interested in. That's sort of the process here. I've included this in the organization, the sort of getting started thing. I'm a bit of an evangelist around this. I think things should be incredibly well organized for data analysis and for projects and things like this. And the way that I think about organizing projects is that everything that is relevant to reproduce any analysis you've done should be all included in the same place. And so I will have like a folder that says, here is everything that is related to this project, and inside of there will be the data, the raw data that I've used, the process data that comes out of it, the code that produces the analysis, the figures that go along with that, the paper drafts and everything, all sort of exists inside of one directory. And for me, that makes it very easy to just remember where everything is and to know that if somebody asks, like, how did you do that, I can just send them the whole directory and say, like, will you open this file and you press run, and that's going to clean the code and that's going to get everything. I think organizing files, organizing structures in this way makes everything much, much easier. One of the things that I'm going to point out when we get into it, the infrastructure that I use to actually do this organization is to use what are called R projects. And I think this is one of the things that I know a lot of people use like R Markdown and use R Studio. I don't know if as many people use R projects. I don't know if this is something. So I like, this is, for me, one of the things that has changed in an awful lot of ways how self-contained the work that I do is, and we'll see why in just a second. This is just sort of the advice that I give students in my class is that most of the time, the collaborator, the person I work with the most often is myself from 6 months ago, and I can never answer questions retroactively, right? So I do a lot of this work in making sure that files are organized and code is reproducible, mostly to save myself a headache in 6 months or in a year when I get a paper review back and somebody says like, we need to rerun this analysis and add this thing to it. Like that, if the code is organized in a way that makes that challenging, that is a real problem. But if I can open up a directory and just understand what I did relatively quickly, well, I'm doing myself a favor. All right, so what we're going to do now is open up RStudio. I'm going to sort of try to make all of this work. What we're going to do is, at least in this first part, do a very, very quick introduction to R Markdown, and I'll run through the R Markdown formatting, relatively quickly, just to sort of, since it seems like many people have an idea of how this works, I'll sort of show how R Markdown works, and we'll go on from there. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about organizing projects and how I sort of structure things in that way. So if you go to the short course webpage. Oh, nobody can see what I'm looking at. Has that been true this entire time? No? Okay, I was going to say, if I've been like sitting here talking and everyone's just like, good point. I appreciate the encouragement, but all right. Okay, now you can see. Okay, great. So if you go to the short course website and you go to this Getting Started page, there's a basic R Markdown file, and if you just click and download this, I'm sort of downloading this to my desktop. I've created on my desktop a short course folder, and I'm just going to like drag and drop that template into the short course folder. And now, let me make sure I can do this. This is not usually, you know what, maybe I can just double click here. I'm going to open up this R Markdown document, okay? And again, can folks, is the text at the back, is it big enough that you can see what's on the screen, or should it be bigger? Is that clear? Okay. So the way R Markdown works is you have a little bit of stuff here at the very top that I'll talk about in just a second. This defines basically some of the overall document outputs. Then there's things that look like text. This is some formatting that says I have a section. There's a little bit of more text, and I have, 2 asterisks here and 2 asterisks here. Then I have this normal distribution. Then there's what I would refer to as a code chunk, and this code chunk contains a few lines of R code that are self-contained. They do some part of things. And then you have another section and a third section. And I'm going to click this knit button here just so that we can sort of connect what is going on in the R Markdown thing to what the output is. So over here, I've got a formatted document. The title here is simple document drawn from the title here. This output format is an HTML document. If I sort of actually go back over here, you can see there's template HTML has been created. That's sort of the byproduct of taking this R Markdown document and knitting it. It took all of the code, it converted it to Markdown, and it produced the output. There are sections. When I sort of talk about formatting, I've used one # hashtag, I don't know what you would call it, one of these to define a section. There's text that is drawn from this text. The formatting, the 2 asterisks has made this text bold. The underscore here has said that the normal distribution is italicized. And the interesting thing, I think the thing that's most powerful about R Markdown here is that the text inside of this, the code inside of this has been copied over here. You actually get the sample of, from a normal distribution, and you get the length of that sample. But you also get the output of that all in one place, right? So the text and the code and the results are all included in this output document, all in the same place, all at the same time. If you go down to the next sort of step, you can actually use R inline, and I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time talking about this, but you can, for example, take the mean of this sample that you drew right up here and print that out in text down below, right? And so things like inline printing, I think, are helpful if you are doing checks on data size. I usually say, you know, what is the dimension of my data set? How many observations do I have? And print that in the text just to make sure that the data set seems like it makes sense. This third code chunk, I'll talk about just a little bit more because it's slightly longer. There are a few things that are going on in here. And so the first thing I'm going to do is explain this code chunk, and then I'm going to sort of talk about what's shown off to the side. So I'm loading here the Tidyverse library, and I guess I want to be clear, this code, although it's written in our Markdown document, if I either put my cursor here or I select these lines of code, I can execute them in the console down below by like Command Enter, and it's going to run those lines of code. And then I'm creating this tibble, a data frame called plot data frame. This tibble is very much like data frames in R that have been familiar for a very long time. I'll talk a little bit more about tibbles in like the next section of the short course, but for now just recognize it's a data frame. I've got an X column and a Y column. I've got observations for X and Y pairs, and that's sort of everything that goes into this. And the next thing that I'm making here is a ggplot, and we'll talk a little bit more about ggplot in the third part of this. But the ggplot here is going to take that plot data frame and create a histogram of the X variable. And so if I just made that histogram off to the side, well then there it is, right? Now what's helpful about having all of this in an R Markdown document again is that if I knit this document and I take a look at the result, I have the title, I've got the first section, I've drawn a sample. Here in the third section, I've got all of the output. I've got, you know, library tidyverse. I've got my plot data frame. And I also have the figure embedded right here. You can see everything that this has produced all in one place, and everything is sort of working very nicely, right? So the goal here, I guess, is to sort of make it clear to folks that if you are going to like write code and write text all in the same place, using R Markdown is a way to make sure that all of that is like self-contained, that the end product is something that you can just share with whoever needs to see it, and it's going to include all of your text and all of your code and everything that goes along with it, right? So I think to myself, most of the time, if I'm able to write a nice R Markdown document, then that's going to produce all of the things that I need, and I really focus in on getting that R Markdown document right. Is that clear to folks so far? Good? Good? Okay. Rahel, you hanging in? Okay. All right. So over on the course website, I'm mostly going to draw attention to a variety of the things that can go on with this. So I've said here, and again, the course website is intended to be relatively self-contained, so you can read through it later. But there are a variety of things that you can change in these code chunks. You can control what your audience sees. So very often, people don't really need to see your code. They don't need to see the messages that go along with those things. There's stuff that they might not need to see. So for example, I don't know that people need to see all of this stuff. And so I could go to this code chunk and add in some options of, I want to turn off echo and I want to turn off messages. And then if I reknit this document, all you're going to see is the data frame that comes out of that. So I'm making sure, in this case, users don't need to see that code, and they definitely don't need to see the messages that come out of it. But it is possible to include the results of that analysis, and all of the code is getting run. The figure is being produced. It's just not showing that. So I often use these code chunk options to control what readers of the document are going to have access to. There are a variety of things here. You can include the code, yes or no. You can turn on warnings or messages. You can collapse output. You can do a variety of other things. And I think understanding these options, again, I could spend a lot of time just talking about R Markdown. I think understanding that these options exist is a helpful thing so that you can tailor whatever your output is to the audience that you care about. There's also included in here sort of a quick cheat sheet on formatting, the kind of formatting that goes into the text here. So for example, you can do bold or italics in a couple of different ways. If you do 2 asterisks or 2 underscore, it's going to be bold. If you do 1 asterisk or 1 underscore, the text is going to be italicized. You can show code format by using backticks. So this is code, right? You can have subsections. So 2 of these hashtags is going to give me a subsection. This is a subsection. And so if I knit this, you'll see, for example, that you have something that looks like the formatting for code, and you get like a subsection that goes along with it. You can have subsections and sub-subsections and so on. You can create tables, you can have lists, you can have bullets, you can have numbers. All of the basic formatting that you would be interested in having in most documents is possible to do in our Markdown. And I'm not going to run through all of that other than to say it's a pretty flexible way to go. You can really get a lot of interesting and useful formatting out of one of these structures. The thing that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and this I think is helpful especially in collaborative projects, is this header information, and in particular the output format. So here I'm saying that this is a simple document and it's outputting in HTML. So if I open up this short course, you'll see there it is, there's my HTML thing, and if I double click this, it actually opens up over here in a web browser. It looks like an HTML document, and you can go along with this. I think, so there's a tension here in that HTML is inherently a little bit more interactive, a little bit more dynamic. It's possible to embed in HTML things interactive maps. You can have user interaction. You can have plots that you can zoom in on. All of that is possible in HTML, and actually the entire short course website here was produced using our Markdown. So whatever sort of tools are in here, like the embedding slides, this is stuff that you can do in an HTML document. But collaborators are often not interested in having HTML stuff emailed to them. So other output formats that I use fairly often are Word documents, and you can sort of knit to this as long as you have Microsoft Office on here, and it'll open up a Microsoft Word document that has all of the same stuff, the title, the text, the formatting, the code, the figures outputted, and all of this in now a Word document. And you can output PDFs as well, I think, as long as you have LaTeX embedded. You can output each of these different formats. And so I think the flexibility here says, you write your Markdown document and it can be exported from that format to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 other different formats down the road. Right? So I use this very often in generating reports for myself or for collaborators. Okay, so the last thing I think that we're going to talk about here, let me make sure, code chunks and snippets we've done, formatting. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about here has to do with project organization. And the project organization, I'm actually going to do a little bit of a detour to talk about how R thinks about where things exist on your computer, right? So you're probably familiar with doing things like, get working directory or set working directory to define where R is or what it's sort of looking at, right? Does this sound familiar? People often start, you say, set my working directory to this, and then, right? So I think that approach is really standard in working with, especially R code in particular, and that is sort of grounded in the idea that the way that you tell R where your project is by using what's called an absolute path. And when I think about an absolute path, what I mean is, on my computer, if I tell R, you're going to start at the home directory, and you're going to go to Dropbox, and you're going to go to the work directory, and then I've given this talk, and I've worked on this project, and whatever, you have to specify that entire path, and that entire path only works for my computer, right? If I took this whole project and I emailed it to you, that doesn't work for you, right? You now have your own path. You have to go and change the working directory. You have to do something different. And that makes, in some sense, the project itself a little bit more fragile. It means that it's relatively reproducible, but all of the stuff that's in here, inside of this is very much tailored to me. And so one thing that I could do, for example, I'm gonna show that this is possible. I'm gonna call this, my ggplot that is a histogram, and I'm gonna save this real quick. And I could do something like ggsave the, so I need to say where to put this, and I'm going to say on my desktop, for example, I want to call this a histogram.pdf, okay? And what I'm going to save is ggp histogram, right? And so now here it is on my desktop right over there, and I've told R exactly where to put it. And if I wanted in this short course to do something like the following, let's say I'm putting this in a results folder, I could change this to desktop short course results histogram PDF. And now if I open this up, inside of my results folder, I've got this histogram, right? And that whole structure works exactly for me, but if I emailed this to Tiffany and I said, click go, it would run its way through this R Markdown document. It would get to this point and it would say, like, no, sorry, that directory doesn't exist. You have to go and change it. You have to do something different. And maybe I could include up at the very top of this, like, a set working directory and then tell Tiffany, like, all right, if you're going to use this, you have to change your working directory. But if we're both working on this project at the same time, we both have to change back and forth. It just gets really, really difficult to do this. So the alternative is, instead of using what I have here, this absolute path starting on my machine going to here, is to say, I want to use a relative path that says from a common starting point, just like start from here and then move over to the next point. And I think this will be more clear in just a second. So what I'm going to use is this R project infrastructure. And to do that, I'm going to come up here to File, New Project. I have an existing directory, and I'm going to make, on my desktop, this short course. I'm going to open this as an R project. I'm going to create an R project inside of this, right? And what's great about this, and I'll sort of demonstrate again, like the thing that's happened over here, inside of this short course thing, there's now this new shortcourse.rproj file. And if I double click on this, it opens up RStudio. Here, everything is, right? And what's nice about this is I can now use relative paths starting from that project to define whatever I'm interested in. And so what I mean by that is I can just assume here that anytime I open up this project, R is going to assume that this is the starting point. And so I don't have to tell it, navigate to my desktop and then into this folder and then into the results and whatever. I can just say, inside of this project, there is a results folder and this is where I want you to save that histogram. And if I took this entire R project and I emailed it to Tiffany, it's the same relative path. She can put that folder anywhere on her computer that she wants to. All of this still works, right? So this project is now much more easily reproducible in the sense that I can take the entire directory and I can send it to anybody. You don't have to change the directory, you don't have to change the path, you don't have to set a working directory, nothing. You just open it up and press go and everything works. And to sort of demonstrate that, I'm going to go into results and I'm going to delete that histogram and I'm going to reknit this document and cross my fingers a little bit. And it created that PDF and it regenerated that histogram inside of this folder without me having to do anything extra, without me having to set an overall working directory here, right? So this whole thing is 90%, I would say, of the workflow that I use for projects that I work on. And what I mean by that is any new project that I'm going to work on, I create an R project and I have a directory for results and a directory for data, and I open up an R Markdown document, and then I use that R Markdown document to write all of the code that I'm interested in, and I use relative paths for everything. I say, if I need to open up a data set, starting from this project, go into the data folder and open this thing up. I don't have to tell it from Jeff Goldsmith /talks /Afreya /short course /whatever, right? I just say inside of this folder, this is the directory that you need to go to. And so this structuring things around relative paths, I think, makes it a lot more transparent for me where everything is. It also, as a byproduct, encourages all of the work that I do to be more self-contained in the sense that if there's something that I need and it's not inside of this directory, well, my relative paths won't work and everything's going to break, right? So I think that the idea that these tools encourage you to do work that is a little bit better oriented, a little bit better organized, I think that all is sort of the thing that we're interested in. Does that make sense? Okay, so I hope at the end of this very short getting started session that everybody is convinced now you should use R projects to organize things and R Markdown to write your code. And it takes a little bit of time to get used to that as a workflow, but it really makes the byproducts of this, the data science work that you do, I think, once you get used to that workflow, substantially stronger and substantially more reproducible. I said, and this is I'm not gonna get into it. I said that this is 90% of the workflow that I use. The remaining 10% is to use Git and GitHub for version control. And I think that is often really important. But it's also, I think, Git and GitHub is just like a tricky thing to deal with, and it's not something that I thought would be a benefit during this short course. But I use Git projects for everything that I do, and the reason is it makes it easier for me to keep track of what has changed over time. I can remind myself, you've added this data analysis, you've changed this variable, you updated this paper. It keeps track of everything that I've done, and it reminds me what's changed along the way. It's also, in pairing with GitHub, it makes it possible for all of this stuff to be publicly available almost immediately, right? So again, I sort of keep pointing to the short course website. All of this is written in our Markdown using RStudio, and the website is hosted on GitHub because it's just like a thing that you can do. If you have all of this on Git, you just push a button and now you have a website on GitHub. So that's a big part of my overall workflow that I'm not going to talk about today, but that gets us a lot of the way there. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now is give Rahel in particular homework on this one. I'm kidding. No, I think what we'll do next is, since we've just gotten started, I know there's sort of like two sections to this. There are actually three components to the short course, and I think what I'll do next is at least get started on the lecture part for the data manipulation piece, and then we can either take a break and come back and do coding, or we can sort of continue through depending on how people feel. Does that sound good?
I think it's also good to point out that a lot of this class is what we want to use for the class called statistical computing and for the program. So I think keeping that in mind when we go through this, and also the idea if we teach this class and sort of this framework starting at the beginning of the master's program, then students will know how to use this workflow throughout their master's degree program. And if we especially focus and emphasize on using just R, let's say in particular, instead of a multitude of different languages, it'll give them the confidence and the ability to continue working with R to a higher level. And so that's sort of what we sort of been pushing a lot through the curriculum development as to why we really wanted to focus on one language and really start with these basics as a foundation right at the forefront and continue working through. So maybe that'll be a good thing to keep in mind when we move through the next few snippets.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent point. One of so this, like I say, this short course is drawn from like the class that we have at Columbia that's sort of parallel to statistical computing and the curricula that we've developed for the master's programs. And one of the byproducts of having this class in the first semester is that they're taking Intro to Biostatistics in parallel, and very often the homework assignments in Intro to Biostatistics are conducted using R and R Markdown and handed in this reproducible format. And so students are both learning how this works and then also implementing it when they're sort of thinking about doing data analyses. And I think Tiffany is absolutely right that sort of considering this as part of an overall infrastructure that students are going to be learning is going to be really helpful. And Isabel, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just thought it might be helpful. Maybe Rahel and Patrick can share with us who will be teaching statistical computing at your two faculties.
I don't think we can speculate now that who will be teaching this, because there are a lot of instructors.
I see. Okay, so is it among from who's attending today, or like the
Dr.
others?
also Mikael.
Okay.
But also Verda will teach the course.
Okay. How about for you?
There are many candidates, and two of them are sitting next to you.
Which 2 out of 3 plastic are you going to specify?
The Davis, there, Evans, also there, but there are others who are not in the room.
All right, I know some of that may still yet to be determined, but I just thought it would be nice to kind of have a sense for the instructors particularly.
All right. So I think I will go ahead and show. All right. So I think the next piece here that I want to talk about is data import and data manipulation. And I think this is, well, I guess I'll ask again, for the folks who are here, and it seems like people have been using studio for a while, and our Markdown in some cases, how many people are using things like dplyr and pipes? When I say dplyr, mutate, select, and piping operations, how many people is that familiar to? Or is this, like, I'm curious, like, how much of this gets, like, really brand new? A bit? Brand new? Okay. All right. So this I think is going to be where things get, like, maybe a little bit newer. And I was saying in the lecture earlier that many of the tools that I actually use for data analysis are pretty new, that it wasn't really possible to use this sort of infrastructure up until a couple of years ago because it didn't exist up until a few years ago. For me, I learned how to do R programming using square brackets to subset things and using column notation, all sorts of, like, that's how I learned to do things. And so for me, this infrastructure it was brand new when I learned it, and it took a little bit of time to get used to, and my guess is that it's going to be relatively new for folks here as well. But this is, I think, really, really important, right? So the process in general of going from data in a spreadsheet to data that you can analyze is, broadly speaking, this idea of doing data wrangling. And I think we all know that can be a very messy process, that importing data can be tough, and reorganizing data and creating variables and doing subsetting. All of this is it can be time consuming, but it's also critical to get right. And one of the things that I think is helpful with this is that the infrastructure that we're going to talk about, the tools that we're going to talk about today, is designed to make that as transparent as possible. It's sort of intended to make it possible to do data wrangling in a way that is clear to others, and also then sort of clear to you when you come back and revisit code later on. The first part of this that we're going to talk about is importing things, right? And I feel like data import is probably going to be the easiest part of this, but I'm going to encourage you to use maybe a tool that is different from what you've seen in the past. So what we're going to use is something from the Tidyverse framework, read_CSV rather than read.csv. There are not like a huge number of differences between these. They often look very similar, but the differences are actually, they turn out to be really important, and I'm going to encourage you to use read_CSV in a lot of cases. What this is going to produce is called a data frame, or even more particular to the Tidyverse, a tibble. And data frames, I think, data frames are this sort of conceptual idea, the way that R organizes data of different types. It looks kind of like a matrix, except you don't have to have everything numbers. You can have numbers and character vectors and factors and logical and all of this stuff sort of organized into a big data rectangle. And a data frame stores all of those different things. The Tidyverse takes that one step further and sort of argues that all of your data frames should be organized into a tidy structure. And that's sort of a big concept that I don't have a huge amount of time to get into, but the idea is that you have a column for every variable and a row for every observation, and that's how your data are structured. We're going to see, this is a bit of an aside, all of the tools in the Tidyverse have a version of data frames very similar to what R has been using for a long time, but they're called tibbles instead of data frames. It used to be a tibble df, and then there was an argument on Twitter about how to pronounce that. They ended up producing the tibble package, and they have a sticker for the tibble package that comes from Star Trek. There's a lot of stuff that happens on Twitter. So why would you use tibbles instead of data frames? They just sort of happen to be a little bit nicer, right? And what I mean by that is if you accidentally print a data frame, it will print this in a way that sort of fits within a console window and you can see everything. It gives detailed summaries, at least reasonably detailed summaries of the variables that you're interested in. It looks an awful lot like a data frame, but it's just slightly better behaved. And if you use read_CSV rather than read.csv, by default this will give you a tibble rather than a data frame and just be slightly nicer. I'm going to focus for now on reading in a CSV using read_CSV, and it's going to look very familiar, I think, to people who have been using R in the past, and so I think that piece is going to go relatively quickly. The thing that I want to point out is that there are other tools for data import, and in particular, Haven and ReadXL are packages in R that I use really often. Haven gives you a way to read in data files from SAS and SPSS and Stata and I think MATLAB and other statistical programming languages. If somebody has given you a SAS file and you want to do your analysis in R, Haven allows you to read that structure in, and it does it really well. I very rarely have issues reading in like an SPSS file using Haven. I think the Read Excel package is in some ways even more impressive in the sense that it operates like Read CSV, but it works on a .xl file. It gives, if you have an Excel file and you need to read that in, for a long time my process was open the Excel file and then save as CSV and then read in the CSV then into R. Using Read Excel, you can just read that in directly, and it looks very much like Read CSV. So I use that kind of all the time. All right. So once you've imported your data frame, the next step in this is to do some data manipulation. And I think there are a few major steps when you start doing data manipulation after you've read in a data frame. And those things are to select relevant variables or relevant columns. You may need to do some filtering to get rid of rows in your data set that are not as useful, not as interesting. You sometimes have to create new variables either from scratch or in ways that depend on other variables in your data frame. And then occasionally it's helpful to rearrange your data set into like a more organized format. Those I would think of are like major steps for data wrangling. I'm not today going to talk about merging multiple data sets, which is an important thing. I'm not going to talk about going from wide format to long format, which is also, I think, a really important thing. There's just not enough time today to get into that. What we are going to talk about are sort of these 4 steps. And the 4 steps play very nicely with functions in the dplyr package. So if you're trying to select columns, you can use the select function. If you're going to filter rows, you can use the filter function. If you're going to add variables, you can use the mutate function. And then if you want to arrange things, you can use the arrange function. All of these functions do pretty much that thing. They sort of work on columns, or they work on rows, or they add variables, or they do something like this. And it sort of pulls everything together. Okay? Where I think you get a lot of power out of this is that the design of the functions in the dplyr package is really, really deliberate. And I think this is like where it gets pretty important. Each function is intended to do exactly one thing, and it does that thing very well, and it does it in a way that I think is really predictable. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to select columns, what the select function expects is that you give it a data frame and you tell it what columns you want to select, and then it gives you a data frame back with only those columns, right? So you put a data frame in and you do something to it and you get a data frame back. And if you want to filter rows, you're going to put a data frame in and you're going to tell it what rows to filter, and it's going to give you a data frame back. And if you want to change things, you put a data frame in and you mutate to define a new column, and then you get a data frame back. But it's always a data frame goes in, you do something, and a new data frame comes out the other side. And that's really, really important because it allows you to do things like select columns first and then filter columns next and then mutate after that. Because if you select, you start with a data frame and it gives a data frame. And that data frame can go directly into filter, and the result of that can go directly into mutate. And so each of these steps that has often been sort of thought of as like, well, first I need to do this, and then given the result of that, I need to do something else. What we're going to see is that you can actually put together these sequences of commands in a way that says like, first you do this, and then you do this, and then you do that. And because each time you're working in the tidyverse, you start with a data frame and you end with a data frame, it all just sort of like comes together, right? You just sort of have data frames all the way through. And the way that you tie these things together is using pipes. This was new to R in 2014. There's an art history joke built into the hexagonal sticker that goes along with these things, which there's hexagonal stickers for a lot of the stuff in the tidyverse. That's a whole lecture unto itself. But there's an art history joke for this, which I really appreciate. But all right, so the way that I'm going to explain pipes is by sort of like talking about how I wake up and get started doing data science. So when I wake up, I start the morning, I wake up and I brush my teeth and I do data science. And let's just assume that those are the 3 things that I do every morning, right? And if I do all of those things, then I'm pretty happy. And if I don't, well, that's a different story. So in R, I think there's like a couple of historical ways that you might have gone about doing this. The first one is to nest each of these things inside of each other, right? So here I am asleep, and there's a function that wakes me up, and then inside of brushing the teeth, I can sort of like wake up, and then I can have a function that brushes the teeth, and then I can have a function that does data science. But like, it's sort of starting from the inside, I do this, and then I this, and then this, and it sort of nests on its way out. There's an alternative way of doing this where you could define intermediate objects. You could take whatever I am and use this wake up function, and then you've got an intermediate object, and you could put that inside of this one and brush some teeth, and then you have an intermediate object, and you could put that here and have this. I think the nesting way of doing things is sort of, especially if you have complicated functions and you have a lot of them, nesting inside of it, you end up with like really, really long nested code that is almost unreadable. You can't look at the code and understand what it's doing. You can do this, but then you have a whole bunch of intermediate objects just floating around, and you don't actually want to have those. So what piping allows you to do is to say, you start out, you do this wake up thing, and then you brush the teeth, and then you do data science, and that's it, right? You just you don't have to define any intermediate objects, and you also don't have to nest things inside of each other. You just do the first step, and then you do the second step, and then you do the third step. And the result of all of these is exactly the same, but the point of using pipes is that this is much clearer, meaning that if I saw this sequence of code, I would know, all right, well, this is waking things up and then doing this and then brushing teeth and then you're done. And like it accomplishes the same goal, but the benefit here is readability. The benefit here is that I could show this to somebody else and they would be able to understand pretty directly how this works, okay? Okay, so that's the end of like this part of things, and the next component would be to like show how this works in code. What do you think? Do we want to break for lunch and then come back to code, or do we want to just like go straight through and do a little bit of coding now? Take a break?
Let me check if the lunch is ready.
Let's check if lunch is ready first.
Yeah, I think it's
I think you have to take a natural breaking point.
Great. This is, I think, a good breaking point. So we'll break and then come back and write some code. Sound good? Good.
So Jeff and Kairos, the food will be here in about 30 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Just the containers, right?
So maybe we start at coffee. Maybe we get another breakpoint after.
Yeah. Sure. All right. So it turns out the food's not here yet, so we're gonna do a little bit of coding for the next little bit. Does that work?
Yeah.
Good. All right. So okay. So what I'm gonna do. I'm going to create a new Markdown document. Actually, I'm going to, shoot, what did I do? I'm going to come over here to short course. I'm going to copy and paste this template and call it data manipulation instead. And then I'm going to open data manipulation here. I'm going to rename this HTML. Okay. All right, so again, I'm gonna do all of the coding that I'm gonna do inside of an R Markdown document, and if you're sort of following along, I encourage you to do the same. If you're not following along, then you can sort of see what I'm doing and ask questions as we go, okay? The first thing that I'm going to do is read in a data set, and in particular, I've got this data set. Let me click to download link file, okay. So this data set is here, it's faslitters.csv, and in sort of keeping with all of the organizational stuff that I do, inside of this short course folder, I'm going to create a data directory and copy that inside of here, okay? So I've done like a little bit of like setting up here at the outset, and in particular that setting up was I downloaded on the course website this data set under data import. Hopefully everybody can sort of find this as we go. I put that into a directory in my short course project, right? So I've got short course R project here. I've got a data folder and the actual data set that I'm interested in. And then I created a new R Markdown file to actually do the data manipulation stuff that I'm going to be doing today, okay?
It says attempt to use zero links variable.
which one does? Tiffany's coming around. Okay, so hopefully Tiffany, you're able to sort of figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna sort of continue with the data import process. Okay. I'm gonna make this a section. I use read CSV to import data. All right. I've inserted here a code chunk. This code chunk is going to be where I import the data set, and we'll sort of go from there, okay? So I'm going to import this FAS litters data frame, and I'm going to read this in using read CSV and relative paths, right? The same ideas that I had used previously. So read CSV is the function that, sorry, I need to load my tidyverse library first. Library tidyverse, okay. So loading the tidyverse is going to make it possible to use all of the functions in the dplyr package that I talked about, and also the read CSV function. You have to sort of load the tidyverse to take advantage of these tools, okay? And I'm going to read in from the data directory, and again, I can use relative paths here because I'm sitting inside of this R project. I can just say go into the data directory and open the FAS litters CSV. Okay, and if I read this in, hopefully it'll read in a data frame, and it sure does. Here is the result. This is like a little bit of background on this data set. This comes from an example. We collaborated with a group that was studying fetal alcohol syndrome using mice as a way to do controlled experiments. And so we have different groups. The control group that has 2 treatment days, day 7 and day 8. There's a litter number, there's gestational day 18 weight. There's a variety of variables inside of here. And I'm sort of naming these things just so that you can sort of like see what's here. We're not going to worry too much about what the data set actually is focused on. One of the things that I'm going to sort of do right here at the outset is actually a little bit of cleaning up. And the reason that I'm going to do this cleaning up is, like I say, I prefer to have a single naming convention that I'm able to use consistently everywhere. And you notice like the variable name here, litter number, is capitalized and then there's a space, and spaces are hard in variable names, but that's what's included in the CSV, so that's what read CSV brought. I'm actually going to do a little bit of data cleaning here at the outset, just to make some of the next steps a little bit easier. So I'm going to do FAS litters CSV, and I'm going to use in the janitor package the clean names function on FAS litters df. Okay, so this is just overriding that same data frame. I haven't changed any of the data, but I have replaced all of the variable names with things that are going to be easier to work with, right? So what janitor clean names does is convert things to that snake case that I had mentioned previously. So now I've got lowercase and underscores separating the similar. So lowercase variable names everywhere and underscores separating words rather than spaces. Okay? How are folks doing so far? I feel like there's a lot happening, yeah? Okay. So, are there consistent things that people are confused about or stuck on? Are there any questions that I can answer at this point? Yeah. Sorry, what's that?
Read underscore CSV.
Yes.
Pass for the data.
Yes. Yeah. So the way that I'm sort of doing things so far, if you have set up a directory using an R project, code like this will work. If you haven't set up an R project yet, it's going to be you're not going to be able to use this relative path structure. You'll have to use something like an absolute path. You'll have to say, read in this CSV from this location. So for this code, for me, this code works because I am inside of this short course R project, and I've loaded the short course.R project, and I'm sort of using a relative path into the data directory to import this data set. If you don't have the R project infrastructure in place, you're going to have to use a different path to import this data set, okay? All right. And so again, the next line of code that I have here says, once you've read this in, the variable names are difficult to work with. And they're difficult to work with because R doesn't like to have spaces in variable names. It's difficult to sort of deal with this. And so what I did was used an existing function to just clean up all of the variable names. I don't want to have to deal with spaces. For me, it's easier to have lowercase words everywhere throughout. But these two steps of importing the data set and then cleaning up the variable names, these are often the first two steps that I use. And again, I want to, you're absolutely right. For this line of code to work, you sort of have to have the R project infrastructure in place. If you don't have that R project infrastructure, you can use a relative path just to get the data imported, okay?
I was wondering janitor is a keyword.
I
thought you were writing a memo, janitor is a keyword.
Okay. All right, did that help? Is that a little bit more clear? Yeah? What do you think? Good. Any more questions? Good.
The file should be the folder called data, right?
Yes. So if you have this file inside of this folder, it should be able to work using a relative path. Okay. Good.
Other than changing the name, possible to make
Additional data cleaning at this point.
Is it possible to make additional?
Additional data cleaning.
By additional data, do you mean changing?
Reducing the dimension perhaps.
Yes. So what we're going to do next is this sort of data manipulation where
function
get rid of
ከዛ ውስጡ ምንድን ነው የምጽፈው?
add variables.
ጄኔሬተር ብለሽ ስፔሲፊክ ምን በኔም ነው በምንድን ነው ክሊል ላድርግልሽ ይችላል አትበልሽ ወደ ኋላ እና አጥፍና ልክ ጄኔሬተር ብለሽ ታዋሪ አራት ነው አይደለም አጥፍሽ ይጃል አጥፍ ከዛ ይጃል አሁን ታውቁት ነው ደግሞ ታውቁት ነው ኦፕሽኖች ነው ታውቁት
ክሊን ክሊን ዶት ምናምን ነው የሚለው። ኦኬ ኔምስ
ከመጻፍሽ በፊት
ኢሜጅ ውስጥ ልትገባ ነው
እሱ በምን ክሊል ላድርግልሽ ዝም ብለሽ
እነዚህ ቴብሎች ናቸው እንዴ?
ነው ፋንክሽኑ አሁን ቶታል ኮለምን ቶታል ሮ ሊያሳይሽ ይችላል። በዛ ፒክቸር አለ ማለት ነው። ታይት እነዚህ ኮንቨርት ያደርገዋል።
እሺ አሁን በኔም አይደለ ክሊን
ኔምስ ይኸውም
ከዛ ምን ነው የምከፍተው እዚህ ውስጥ
ታሪክና እንትን ነው አትሪቢዩት እንትን ዴታሽ ምንድን ነው ስሙ ሊትርስ
ካፒታል መሰለኝ። ይሄ የትኛው ነው? ይሄን ሊትርስ ዴታ
ሊትርስ አንተ
All right. So I think what I'll do next is to sort of show at least a couple of the steps that I had talked about being able to do in dplyr. Okay? Does that sound good? Yeah. All right. So let's do some data manipulation. So The four functions that I talked about in dplyr as being useful are things like select, and then filter, and then mutate, and then sometimes arrange. And I'm going to sort of demonstrate each of those as we go, right? So the first thing that I'm going to do is use the select function to select columns in this litters data frame. So if I use select in the litters data frame, let's see, FAS, litters data frame, what I need to say are what are the columns I would like to select, right? So let's just say, again, the top of my litters data frame has group and litter number and GD0 weight, okay? And let's suppose that those are the three columns that I want to select and I don't care about anything else. So I'm in the select function, I'm going to say, tell me which columns I'm interested in selecting, and I will just list those out. I'll say group and litter number and GD0 weight. And if I run that line of code, it produces a data frame with just those three columns. And if I wanted to put these, let's say I don't want litter number, I just want group and GD0 weight, I can get just those two columns, okay? Right, so the idea here is that in select you're going to tell it what columns you want, and you're going to tell it which columns you don't, and it's going to be possible to select each of those different things, okay? There are a variety of things that are shorthand in the select function that make it easier, right? You might sort of think, what if I want to select all of the columns in some range? Well, you can do that by saying, for example, maybe I want to select everything from group up to GD18 weight, okay? So if I want to select everything from group to GD18 weight, that's the fourth variable, I'm going to use this colon group, from group to GD18 weight, and if I press enter there, it selects all of the columns between those two things. If you want to select all of the columns except something, maybe I want to get rid of that group variable, I can use minus group and run this, and it will keep everything except for the group variable, right? There are also, I guess I'll sort of point out, there are a variety of helpful functions inside of this. So you can select all of the variables that starts with GD, and that will select the three columns, gestational day 0 weight, gestational day 18 weight, and gestational day of birth, the three columns that start with this. You can mix and match some of these things. You might do starts with gestational day and then group, and it will keep all of those different things, right? So there's different ways that you can select the groups inside of here. One of the reasons that I think this is helpful is that I'm not selecting columns by number. I'm not selecting columns using some other bracket notation. I'm just telling inside of a data frame, give me these variables, and it's going to produce those things, okay? Is that clear? Good? Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to show is filtering. And filtering is, instead of selecting columns, I'm going to be selecting rows. I want to get rid of things. So filter has a very similar structure. I'm going to filter in the FAS litters data frame, and now I have to decide which rows do I want to keep in my data set. This is sort of the question that I'm interested in here. What rows do I want to keep? And let's say that the way that we're going to define these rows is based on something inside of that data frame. So I'm going to say here, maybe what I want to keep is everywhere where the group is equal to con7, the control 7 group. And it will give me only those rows. And if I wanted to keep everything in the control 8 group, it will give me only those rows. And the nice thing here is that the filter function allows you to use whatever logical expression you might care about given the data that's in front of you. So you might be interested, for example, in everywhere where the gestational day 0 weight is greater than 20. You might change that to be greater than 25. And each of these will be a filtering operation on your data set. It will give you the rows where whatever this conditional, this logical expression, wherever that's true, those are the rows you're going to get back. And you can combine a variety of these. You can say, I want gestational weight 0 greater than 20, and I want group equal to con7, and it will give you back the few rows where that's true, okay? So again, the idea here is that you've got a data frame and you want to extract some of the rows that you care about, and you're going to use the filter function to do that, right? And so the structure of the filter function, again, is very similar to the select function in the sense that you start with a data frame, you do some process, and you get a data frame back. And in the filter function, you start with a data frame, you do some process, and you get a data frame back. Okay? Is that clear? Okay. The next thing that I'm going to show is mutate. Mutate allows you to add columns or change columns to a data set. So let's say in the mutate function, I'm going to mutate, again, start with a data frame, FAS litters DF, and now I'm going to define some new variable that I care about. And in this case, I'm going to call this weight change or weight gain, going from gestational day 0 to gestational day 18. How much weight did the mouse mother gain during pregnancy? So let's call this weight change, and I'm going to define this variable as the difference between two other things inside of my data set. So GD18 weight minus GD0 weight, right? And it's hard to see here, so I'm going to view this whole thing, right? But you see here at the tail end of my data set, I've got a weight change variable, and it's going to be whatever the difference between day 18 weight and day 0 weight was. Right? So for this pup, it was 19.7, then 34.7, gained 15 grams, and there's my weight change variable. Right? And that's, you get sort of all of whatever that variable is throughout my data frame. Okay? Is that clear? All right, so again, we've got select, we've got filter, and we've got mutate. You can do things like arrange, and I guess maybe I'll arrange real quick. So let's do arrange FAS litters data frame, and let's say we want to arrange by GD0 weight. It's going to spit everything back where now the lowest gestational weight is here and the next highest and the next highest. And so you can do some of this data structuring if you're interested in it, okay? Now, I think this is, when we teach this class, I think this is one of the ones that is a little bit challenging. Like this is part of what makes this difficult is there's a lot of new functions here, and hopefully the individual functions make sense. If you talk about what does select do, you start with a data frame, and then you say what are the columns that you want to select, and then what does filter do? You start with a data frame, and what are the rows that you care about, and you start with mutate. You get a data frame, and then you ask what is the new variable that you want to define, right? And all of those, I think, individually are relatively easy to understand what the goal of them are and how they work. And where it always gets a little bit confusing, and so this is sort of at the outset, I want to say it takes time to get used to this workflow. Where this gets confusing is to say, now I want to piece all of these different things together into one relatively transparent process. So let's just sort of imagine, let's do a data process pipeline. So what I mean by that is, I'm going to say that the thing that I want to start with is the FAS litters data frame, okay? And I'm going to use this pipe operator here to say the next thing that I want to do is select some columns. And I don't have to reiterate that it's in this data frame. I don't have to do anything else. I'm just going to say start with this data frame and select the group column and everything that starts with GD gestational day, okay? And so if I start here and I do this selection, it's as if I had just selected those columns, okay? But what's nice is that I started with a data frame, and what's happened here is also a data frame. And so I can then reuse this pipe operator and go directly into the next thing that I care about. And I can filter this resulting data frame based on group is equal to, say, con7. Okay? And if I run this, I've still started with my data set, I've restricted to these columns, and then I've filtered based on these rows, and I have the result that I care about. Okay? And I can even take this and then move on to my next step and do a mutate piece of things and define a new variable inside of this data frame where I say weight change is GD18 weight minus GD0 weight. And now I've got this new weight change variable on the tail end. But I've done 3 separate data manipulation parts all in just sort of 3 lines of code, right? So I started with my data frame, I selected columns that I cared about, I filtered rows that I cared about, and I defined a new variable. And all of this is sort of in one self-contained collection of operations that started with a data frame and then sort of used tools in dplyr each step along the way to get to an analytic data frame that I actually care about at the end, right? Now again, like this, like when I sort of started using this infrastructure, it took me a really long time to get used to it. It took me a really long time to like have this be the default way that I write code, but it's become the default way that I write code, is to just start with a data frame and then do this and then do this and then do this, okay? So I guess like what I would say right now is that like this piece might not make total sense, but hopefully it's the, like at least the conceptual framework of what dplyr is trying to do and how you might piece these commands together. Hopefully that part does make sense. Yeah? Does that sound good? Okay. All right, so I think hopefully we're closer to lunch. I think at the very least everybody needs a little bit of a break. So maybe we'll sort of pause now and then reconvene after a little while. Sound good? Oops.
Yeah, the one for Jonathan, I had a longer list. I think it would be the one for Jonathan and you side. So I thought maybe just the PI sign somewhere. The others, what have the 14 sign? I mean, I don't know. So you can sign all of these. I'm going to bring more later. Most, this is the only one where you want to right? The rest is, whatever you like. Someone recognizes it. I go, let's see if it's alright. Maybe one of these my signatures is hey, how do you do that? Yeah, maybe like down here. Sorry, I didn't see much space.
You're in charge of
I'm going to be your tutor. Your tutor for the next session.
Why? How?
Because
She's going to go.
ይሄኛው ማለት ነው።
እነዚህ ነገሮች አሁን ፊልተር ፈልግ አንሰር ግሩፕን ይሄ የራሴ ዳታ ነው አይደል? ፍሬሽ ዳታ እና ብቻ እሱ ያ ኮሜንት
የሁሉንም ሬሾ ያመጣል። ወደ ኔክስት
እዚህ በመሀል ጨምሩበት ነው። ኦልሬዲ ማድረግ የለብንም።
እቺ የጻፍኳት ቴክስት ነች። ቴክስቷ ነች። ሁሉንም ሬሾ ብሎ አዲስ ሬሾ የዋናው ቴብል አካላይደለም። ከአንድ በታች አንድ
እቺ መዝጊያ ናት። መክፈቻ ከላይ ተከፍቷል።
አሁን ሴሌክት
አንድ በታች እነሱ ስለዚህ እዚህ ጋር ምን እናደርጋለን?
ስታርት ዊዝ
ሄድላይን ከትከፍትና
ይሄ ሌተርስ ዴታ የራሴው ዴታ
ፊልተር
የዴታው ስር መሆን
አንድ
አለበት።
በታች
እዛ ጋር ያለው ስታርት ዊዝ ብራኬት ስታርት ዊዝ አንደርስኮር
ኮንዲሽኑን የሚያሟሉት እነሱ
ጂዲ
ወደ ሌላ ሎሪንግ መሳት
ዘጊና ፐርሰንት ከዛ ብራኬት መጨረሻውን አጥረዋል። ብራኬቱ
እንችላለን። እችኛዋ ትንሽ ስለሆነች
ፐርሰንት ግሬተር ሳይን አንድ ላይ ስፔስ አታላ ግሬተር ፐርሰንት
እዚህ ጋር ሪዛልት እንለውና ሪዛልት ማለት ይሄ ነው። ዴት ያደረግና ሰሌክት ያደረጋል። ሰሌክት ሲያደረግ ዌይት
እዛ ነገር ውስጥ አለ ሪድ ሲኤስቪ ፋይል ሚንራነር
እሷ መስመር ብቻ ነው።
ከዚህኛው ላይ
ዶት ቀረች እዚህ ጋር
ላይ ነበር
So because I know how it is created, what I do is now I come here and copy that file and from here.
You
see, you cannot decide where to put it. Yes. Yeah, it should you decide. I download it. See documents. So this is the file. So what I'll do is I will just cut it. So I need to check the name. So I install it once. Install it on the package.
So Patrick, I'm going to ask you to sign some of the thank you letters.
Signature of my name?
Yes, exactly. So, sorry, this one is a bit long, but, you know, like yours, just write your name and just put PI so that...
So I write here below?
Yeah, anywhere in this area would be perfect. The others have more space. I thought you, the PIs would all kind of start at the top and some others. Okay? So, I'll bring more later, but.
Yeah, but let me sort her out first.
Oh, sure.
So which one is more
Yeah. So once I do this is the name now I'm using. You can
ሲጨርስ የሚፈልገው እዛው ማለት ላይ እዛው አስቀምጥ ያኛው ሴቭ አድርገው ሲሆን ግን እዛው ላይ ተሰጥቷል። ሳይዙ አይደለም ምን ሳይዝ ከዛ ኢንፋይናይት ቫልዩ ያለው እዚህ ጋር ግራፍ የሚሰራ እነዚህ ያለው እነዚህ ሪዩት ስለዚህ ምናደርግ
So now you can do now this is something that you get my data. I can call it and then I'm using it's a new file of
ግን አልመጣልኝም ነው እንግዲህ
ሚቲንግ ብለሻል ዛሬ
በሱ ሲካፈል ናቸው ይሄ is different from ፍሎት ያደረግልን ሪዛልት ስለዚህ ቀደም ኢራሮቹ መጥፋት አለባቸው በዚህ ጊዜ ምን አይነት ግን እንትን አለመቻለን ሁሉም different from
sometimes you can if you select one, for example, select all these, excluding the first one. I'll just put that's interceding.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, like
yes, you're telling it's negative that. So that is one more chapter. The other one is
ጀት
Yes.
maybe I want columns with parties that are less than 5. Yeah. So then I can do that and introduce something else. So reducing my data, introduce another 5. Or like another 5.
no into inside
Separate now. Like the control set. I don't know whether I don't know because I
No, this is not it's more so I'm going to change to be capital. So we're using this for
we took the data, we just a new variable, then select only two of the columns. And we want to
When I say view,
we
it
want
was
to
capital letters, that's why
I know, so
the ratio. We want to draw the graph the ratio because this is since some of the data is empty, so it's going to be infinite. So we don't want to see those with an NA value.
has all of your capital
Now what
letters,
happens is
right?
we did that, but
you have, for
what we call warnings
Actually, I think what I'll
are
do-
displayed. We don't want to see this one because this is not part of our code. This is a code and this is a result. So how can we remove?
So there's a feature for the art that
So
you'll have
this-
to add
this
up
way we
here,
don't have to
where
keep
I
track
think you're
of
gonna have to go to the page that has it in the
Which is
website. That says like warnings equal false, or there's a part of Markdown where you can actually remove that.
The warnings that come from the
The
compiler.
warnings that come from it, exactly. Saying, I think like any of the error part, you can remove all of that, so again, you're only left with the code and the
Yeah. During the experimentation, it is important to see the warning.
Right, exactly.
Once
But
you're
during
done,
the
you
final
don't.
draft,
You don't
you
want
need
to
it.
see that.
Yeah, so I think you can either do,
Shall we?
yeah, maybe, there are different like outputs. You can do like R Markdown, like
we have to change
You have to change.
options.
So here,
Yeah.
all of this.
And so there are often these like really nice options that you can
It
use.
produces here exactly the data ranges.
This one.
Right, you have these columns.
That one's
You
probably
have your weight
the
changes. That's it.
Got
Got it.
So really that's equal to false.
Now you're ready.
Warning gets generated like code of creating finish line and warnings. So you'll probably want to turn those off because what you're getting are warnings. Saying that warning, this is just happening, but you can turn that off in your like Markdown by like adding those options here. So I don't remember what I think it's just warning.
I think it's warnings equals false.
Yeah.
Warning equals false.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe
I think it means that
Oh, I think we got it.
the window, even the window is the same.
The command and shift.
Yeah.
Oh.
And you can also put message
With a comma or just?
yeah.
Okay. I just
Hayır, çan konseptiyonlar argümanı
It's a comma or let's say.
But it means so that
All of this.
in future.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be good.
That'd be good. Great.
Yeah. What part of it, you know?
This
There you go. Yeah.
So let's say it's very clear on the console.
Right, but not in the so I think you can actually remove the warning, right? That's happening. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. That's what it's more
Whether it's changed or not, because we don't have any warning, right? That's good. Yes. Kok pendapat bagaimana papernya di kesepakatan? Result menurut mas. kita ingat untuk level 3 level 8 legend caption ምናምን
Is it function over function over function? No, it's just composition of three functions. Yeah, three functions. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it's like what you regulate, right? If I run this class now, you should have
from like traditional art, the art that we all know.
But instead of your title, you can actually have the maximum.
But they are so umeingia tu direct. Bila copy.
I'm not sure.
Practice ይችላል።
I feel like some of my code is like gibberish. Try to transition. I
Code? Construction is 7
I learned that. They didn't like R on my own.
I haven't managed to navigate that.
How is that possible?
I actually taught a class using SAS, but now learning SAS myself. I was like, I told my GA the other day, I was like, you're good.
Then there's like my analysis of data. I'm like, yeah, I can figure out how to use data.
Yeah, but
Oh, like recitations and grad school on this data. I don't know. Objects there are service courses, although they have like a parallel R version of that.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, so they're like the 620 is the main service course. I think they have multiple sections, and I think one of them people self-detect into in R rather than S, which. Do you know what I actually like? So I'm a big fan of like they use R instead of Stata. They've also largely gotten rid of like TCAS and proportions. They're just like everything is regression, which it is. I love it.
180 ነው
It's hard. So I have to work with like stats for one data set. I feel like it's very fast into practice though, and so like going back between the two. Yeah, it's challenging.
you know, there are two ways of
There's a lot of
then I say my data is state. But these two commands are the same. Because you have said this is the data, then just like this one. This one.
wow.
So maybe there's a problem with the one.
አይጨረስኩ እኮ ግን የእንትን የሰጠኸው ቫሪያብል ኔሙ ካፒታል ሌተር ነበር የሁሉም እዛ ዳታው ነው የሰጠነው ዴታ ኮለም ነበር ካፒታል ሌተር ነበር ሲወጣ ግን ስሞል ሌተር ነው የወጣው እኔ ቀይርልኝ
በእኔ ማጸዳሽው አልሽ አይደል እንዴ ጄኔተር ብለሽ በእኔ ማጽዳት
ስሞል ሌተር አድርጋችሁ ማለት
ነው እንግዲህ ቢሆን ነው ባይሆን ነው ያደረገው ነው
እዛ ፋንክሽን እኮ ቀይር ኮንሲስተንት ኔም
They're the same data variables.
That information already.
But it's not that is being
እስካሁን እንደዚህ አውጥቶ ዴታውን ፊልተር አድርገን ቶፒክ ወንጀል ፖዚሽን እና ታይትላችን ዴታ ዳይሬክሽን ሚውቴሽን
Let me find it.
yes. Thank you. For you, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you? I don't know why you're getting an error. One at a time. Yeah. I think if you run mine one at a time, it's gonna have a number like much stronger time. Yeah. We have to yeah, see, it's pretty, 7 by 11. You've got it working perfectly. So you can't run like one line because that line depends on everything you do. You have to have everything first and say, given the entire tip that I've created up to this point, what do I do next?